Greetings. I'm Jeffrey Hill, Associate Commissioner at BLS for our Inflation and Consumer Expenditure Statistics. I appreciate you joining us today. Please note that we are recording this webinar and will post it on our website and on our YouTube channel as soon as possible. We are holding this webinar on the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, for two reasons. First, there has been tremendous interest in January's divergence of two key CPI shelter measures, rent and owner's equivalent rent, henceforth referred to as OER. Today, Rob Cage, Assistant Commissioner for the CPI, will discuss in detail the data and its underlying methodology. Most of what Rob will discuss is publicly available data or is derived from publicly available data. However, part of his discussion will include information that only someone at BLS who has access to detailed price and weighting information can compile. From time to time, we conduct these deep dives into the detailed price data to help understand emerging price changes. I equate this to some of the articles we publish in our monthly labor review and Beyond the Numbers venues available on the BLS website. For instance, in February 2023, we published a Beyond the Numbers piece on shrinkflation that was quite popular and resulted from a special study of data by one of our economists. As time passed, we received requests to update the information, and we did so last December with data through October 2023. We accomplished this research by diverting the same economist away from other priorities in order for her to have time to compile updated figures. We do the best we can with our resources, and today's discussion of rent and OER follows our commitment to customer service. However, some of the special data Rob compiled, we may not be able to provide on an ongoing basis. I should mention, though, that BLS staff is always happy to speak with customers about our economic statistics, their underlying methods, and how to use the data. Everyone gets the same information. This brings me to the second reason for this webinar, which is to clarify confusion BLS created on February 27th around the notion that we provide special access to a set of super users. BLS does not provide special access to some users, nor does it maintain a list of super users. In the situation that occurred, a staff member was replying to multiple inquiries for information about the CPIs for rent and OER. To expedite a response, the employee blind copied a number of requesters and referred to them as super users. This was a mistake. Further, the response did not take into account a complete evaluation of the divergence between rent and OER. This rushed evaluation led to an insufficient and unsatisfactory response that was not shared equitably with all data users. As BLS economists and statisticians completed an interim review, we posted a notice on February 29th. BLS strives to make data and information equally available to all customers. We work hard to maintain high standards of communication, but failed this time. We will do better in the future. We appreciate your understanding of the situation, your patience as we work to provide more information, and your interest in the real topic of how we measure rent and OER. Speaking of more information, we take care to be transparent while safeguarding confidential data and meeting our disclosure responsibilities. In 2020, BLS researchers, in collaboration with researchers at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, suggested in a paper published on the BLS website that BLS should refine its weighting method for OER in the CPI according to structure type to reduce suspected upward bias in the OER index. In April 2022, a report from the Committee on National Statistics reinforced the importance of accounting for structure type in our methods. In September 2022, BLS announced we would do so, and in January 2023, we introduced the new weighting method. Rob will explain the many technical details. At the time, we did not explain that the weights involved would be updated annually, effective with the January index. In retrospect, we recognize that we should have then and can now provide more about this aspect of the OER methodology and will update our website accordingly. We also will update the website based upon questions from this webinar. However, we will not rush to provide updates, just as we did not rush to hold this webinar, because rushing leads to mistakes, and we do not want to compound our recent mistake further. Rob will try to address many of the questions received over the past week in his talk. The question and answer feature of this webinar is open, but I hope you will allow Rob the opportunity to cover his topics thoroughly before submitting questions. Rob, I, and our team will answer as many questions as we can today, and then we will respond further by updating the website. Rob, please proceed.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. And thanks to everyone for joining today. It is my pleasure to be here with you to discuss the CPI and specifically to examine more closely our shelter index products. The CPI continues to be in the spotlight as annual rates of inflation have not yet quite returned to pre-pandemic norms, as shown here. Many observers have noticed shelter inflation continues to run high and have hypothesized that rent inflation is the main reason overall inflation remains above the pre-pandemic norm and hovering between 3 and 4% over the past several months. There are many ways to isolate and analyze the impact of shelter on the headline CPI. Personally, I like to take shelter out of our basket and then examine the behavior of the all items less shelter index shown here. Now, prior to the pandemic, all items less shelter ran a little bit lower than all items. So by deduction, shelter inflation was higher than overall inflation for this period. Now, this was not true during the peak of the pandemic inflation, the summer of 2022, as other categories such as food, utilities, and transportation accelerated and outpaced the price change for shelter. However, as those other categories have decelerated, shelter has been slow to join in the deceleration. And this results in this gap that we observe today with all items at 3.1%. and all items less shelter at 1.5% year over year. So this slide here shows the exact same information as the previous slide, just looking at the net difference. Pre-pandemic, all items less all items less shelter was positive, almost a full percentage point per annum, with an average of 0.8 percentage points year over year. We do see that it flipped directions during the pandemic, with other categories outpacing shelter inflation, but we are now back to the pre-pandemic norms. However, the average is still high. The average over the last year is 1.6 percentage points. So one can deduce from that that shelter component has caused the CPI not to return to pre-pandemic levels fully. Now, shelter does have a noteworthy contribution to the headline all items index. As of December 2023, its weight in the CPI market basket was 36.2%. Now, some might think shelter reflects only the rental cost of owned homes and rented homes, but it is more than that. Our definition includes 4 component categories, as shown here. Shelter includes tenants and household insurance. It includes lodging away from home, such as spending on hotels and motels and lodging while at school. And of course, the big components are the rent that renters pay for their housing and the owner equivalent rent, or the rental value that owners have for their owned homes. If we look at the most recent published data for these categories, shelter overall and the rent and OER components show a 12-month change around 6%, about twice the all items inflation. Lodging away from home, though up sharply over the month, has a modest 12-month increase. And the low-weighted tenants and household insurance category is up over 4% year over year and was up fairly sharply over the month. If we take a longer term picture of just the rent and the OER components, pre-pandemic, we see that the owner's equivalent rent index on average, and this is very typical, runs a little bit lower than rent inflation, although there's some more volatility in the series post-pandemic. After the start of the pandemic in March 2020, we saw the rent inflation actually dip below owner's equivalent rent before rising above OER, almost a full percentage point. But now the story is somewhat that rent is decelerating back down to the OER level. Now we can examine this difference on a 1 month change, and it is a bit of a different story and a more volatile story. So this graph here shows the 1 month difference in OER price change, seasonally adjusted, minus the 1 month price change for rent over the past 10 years. Any dot on this graph outside the shaded band it reflects the possibility of divergence. Any dot inside the shaded band shows that the indexes are somewhat close. Now we publish to 1/10 level of precision, so any dot inside the shaded band could lead to no difference between the OER minus the rent change at that published level precision. But I'm showing here the percent change that one could calculate off of the index levels as published on the website. So it's 3 decimal places. And of course, as most commentators and observers have seen, we do have a very high difference, OER minus rent, in January of 2024. It's at the published level of precision, it's 2/10, but at this more close examination, it's actually a 0.198. And that does make it the largest positive difference in this series since October of 1995, so almost 30 years. On a not seasonally adjusted basis, it's 0.189, so about the same wedge. Looking back at the history of this series since 1998, when the existing methodologies that we have in place now were first put in place, at the published level of precision of 1/10, 50% of the time, there's no difference between OER and rent. 44% of the time, it's a 1/10 difference. And 5% of the time, it's a 2/10 difference. So while many observers think that this might be an anomaly, it's not unprecedented. It does occur, but it's rare to be different by 2/10. So what's causing this gap? Why is this gap exist? As many of you know, price change for owner's equivalent rent is imputed by price change for rent. So you might be thinking they should be exactly the same. Why are they different? What causes them to diverge? And specifically, what caused the large 0.2 gap in January? So for those of you who are intimately familiar with the BLS Handbook of Methods and CPI methodology, you know that there are 4 reasons, technically, that the owner's equivalent rent index and the rent index can diverge. They are separated here on this slide by features associated with prices, or our component index methodology, and data that we use to compile those component indexes. And at the bottom, by weights, features that we use based on spending data to compile our aggregate indexes that are published. So what are these 4 reasons? First, the sample of housing units that we use for OER and rent in each area isn't identical. They're different, and that can cause these 2 measures to diverge. Second, the unit level weights may be assigned to each unit that's used in both indexes can be different, and that can cause the 2 measures to diverge. Third, the actual rent value for the exact same unit that we assigned to the rent index can be different than the rent value that we assigned for that exact same housing unit for the OER index, primarily because of utility adjustments. And for this reason, this difference in the actual price or rent value of each housing unit, that can explain divergence. And finally, area weights. The spending data that we use at the second level or aggregate step of our methodology can be different for rent and OER, and this feature can cause these two measures to diverge. Now, the email that was distributed last week to some of our users sort of intimated or suggested that the second component, unit level weight assigned to each unit, was the primary cause, and specifically an increase in the weight of single family detached homes in the OER index contributed to the difference. Now, while this is part of the story, it is not the complete story. So what is that story? We can approximate the impact or contribution of each of those four features I just walked through on this gap, on this divergence, by performing an additive decomposition. So this is original analysis performed on the underlying source data, analysis that we do not routinely perform and publicly disseminate. So I'm about to share with you some very interesting and exciting results for the very first time. So we can start with the 1 month not seasonally adjusted change for rent at this 3-level decimal place of 0.344. And then we can make those upper level weights the same. We can force the relative area weights for rent to be those that we use for the OER. And when we do that exercise, we get a change for rent of 0.378. Then we can force the samples to be identical. Let's throw out the units used for rent that are not used for OER and see what that looks like. And when you do that, the measure grows to 0.387%. Next, we can make those prices the same. We can throw out the contract or economic rent prices that were used for rent and replace them with the pure rent prices that were used for OER. And when we do that, the measure grows to 0.436. And then finally, we can replace the rent level weights for the housing units with our OER weights, and that will get us up to the 0.533% owner's equivalent rent measure. Now, the statisticians in the audience will know that the order that one performs this additive decomposition exercise does matter. You can get slightly different results if we worked in the opposite direction, in other words, starting from the OER price change and working backwards. So the takeaway here is that if we look at the relative size of these horizontal bars, we can get a rough approximation of the magnitude. So from this analysis, one might conclude that the gap between OER and rent, 1 month change for January, roughly was caused by 20% of that gap is explained by the difference in our upper level weights. 5% of it is explained by the difference in the sample used for each measure. But the vast majority of it is explained by these lower level differences in the prices that we use for our housing units and the unit level weights. Now, let's hone in on the impact of single family detached housing in our sample. So we can run some counterfactuals to measure or estimate what the actual impact that these units have on our published measures. So here on this slide, I show our official index. These are not seasonally adjusted numbers. So OER was 0.5, rent was 0.3, a gap of 0.2 at that 1 month level of publication precision. We can take out the single family detached units in our sample and see what impact that has. When we do that at published levels of precision, there's no difference. A second way to measure impact is let's keep those single family detached units in the sample, but let's remove the structure type adjustment, that this refinement, this improvement in our methods that we made in January 2023 to isolate the impact that weighting improvement has on the estimates. And when we do that exercise, again, we get the exact same result. No difference in published precision. However, we can look closer. We can look at that 3 decimal place precision and sort of drill down to what's going on behind these published numbers. So at the 3 decimal place level, the official index minus the rent index, again, not seasonally adjusted, 0.189. Let's remove the single family detached units, and we see that that gap is smaller. The rent index is 0.335 and the owner's equivalent rent index 0.472, so lower. So one thing to notice here is that must mean that the single family detached units in January had a higher rate of inflation than the non-single family detached units. But the difference in this wedge is 0.052, so one might conclude from this exercise that the contribution of single family detached housing units to our OER minus rent difference is about 28%. Let's keep those single family detached units in the sample, and let's remove the structure type adjustment. And when we do that, we get OER at 0.524 and we get rent at 0.334. Again, the rent number doesn't change because the structure type adjustment is not performed on rental units for the rent index. It's only performed on the OER. So when we do this exercise, we get 0.180, a differential of 0.009, much smaller. So from this analysis, one might conclude the contribution of structure type adjustment to the wedge, to the gap, is only about 5%. So that's the story. That's the takeaway. And so for the remainder of this presentation, I plan to methodically and step by step walk through the mechanics of our CPI index methodology to explain how we arrived at this result. Now, I'm going to warn you that the material is highly technical and in some places extremely nuanced and complex. I hope not to lose you, and in that pursuit, I promise not to show any equations. But I think if we all fasten our seatbelts and if you bear with me, I think we'll be able to get through it in the allotted time. So here we go. First, I want to start with this conceptual question. Why do we have OER in the first place? Why do we not simply directly include in the CPI the purchase and resale of owned homes? And it's a great question, and there's a great debate about this in the price index number literature. But the main reason that we do not include and track home sales is that the purchase and the resale of homes has an investment component to it. And for the CPI, we want to measure only spending on consumption. When someone purchases a home, stays in it for a long period of time, and then sells it, the equity growth in the asset generates a capital gain. This piece of home buying needs to be removed from a CPI. And there are several ways to do that. There's no right or wrong method. Considerable debate in the price index in the literature about the proper method. I show here on this slide some of the notable treatment options for owner-occupied housing. First of all, you could just exclude it from the index altogether. That's one thing you could do. In fact, Eurostat does this in their harmonized index product, or HICP, that some of you might be aware of. Another approach is an acquisitions approach. Let's count as the weight the actual purchase price of homes, and let's track. And you could even track home sales under this approach if you wanted to. A payments approach is another option where instead of using rental equivalents, you measure the actual out-of-pocket expense of owners, and this might include mortgage principal, mortgage interest, property taxes, and so forth. Now, this method has been proposed for indexes used for escalation. There's a little bit of significant literature on this topic, suggesting that's the better approach for escalation purposes of a CPI. And then we have user cost and owner's equivalent rent. And the literature and most economists agree that this is the most suitable approach for the macroeconomic use of the CPI, using the CPI as a barometer of the economy. So we use the owner's equivalent rent approach, abbreviated OER. And essentially, under this approach, we're estimating what the rental value of an owned home would be if the owner were renting it. So if you can see the title of this slide, it's aptly titled, "Everyone is a Renter." because in the CPI conceptual method, that's exactly how we are treating owners under this rental equivalence approach. Okay, just a word about where we're collecting our data. The CPI represents the urban population. We do not represent the rural population. The rural population, by our definition, is shown on the map as any county that is not shaded in a color. We use a core-based statistical area, or CBSA, as our official technical sampling unit for geography. You can think of that as a metropolitan area or a city. So I'll just call it a city from this point forward. Almost 1,000 of them in the country. We select 75, so we have a sampling rate of over 8% of the cities. These CBSAs are county-based definitions. And so our sample represents 473 counties in the country, roughly 15% sampling rate. But if you look at the population in those counties and the number of housing units in those counties, very interesting fact. Over half of the population is eligible to participate in one of our surveys, and half of the housing units. And we have three primary surveys to compile the CPI. One is the CNS pricing survey, which I won't be speaking about today. That's the survey that we use to collect prices for categories other than shelter. But one survey is the housing survey. This survey is exclusively used to measure rent and OER price change. The data are and we put together the CPI in 2 steps. So the housing survey data is used in that first step, or we call it stage 1. Here, we're compiling the micro level or the unit level data into what we call component indexes, one for each of those cities, or we have 32 elementary areas. The cities get mapped into elementary areas. So in our jargon, you might hear these described as basic indexes or elementary indexes or lower level indexes, all referring to the same thing. It's the building blocks of the CPI, the component level. For the economists in the audience, you know that we use a Laspairs price index number formula for this measure. And for the rent component, the housing survey is a sample of just rental units. There are no owned units in the sample. So we're tracking price change of rental units. For OER, we do not have a separate sample of owned units. Instead, we take the quote unquote exact same sample that's used for rent and impute or approximate the change in the rental value of the owned housing stock by the sample of renters. That's how we do it in the first stage. In the second stage, we take spending data derived from a completely separate and independent household survey, the Consumer Expenditure Survey. It's conducted by Census on our behalf. And we take those spending data to average or aggregate up to published products, the component indexes. In our jargon, we call these upper level indexes, or you might hear them referred to as upper level indexes. This survey does use a sample of both renters and owners. The owners represent roughly 65% of the CE sample, while renters are approximately 35%, although those percentages can vary by city. And I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. For spending, rent is simply the out-of-pocket expense that our respondents report, the renters, the respondents that are renters on their rental unit. For owner's equivalent rent, we ask the owners to guess, to estimate, and here's the question, what do you think your home would rent for unfurnished and without utilities? Arguably, this is the most important question in the Consumer Expenditure Survey because it is the basis of our rental equivalent weight. Some respondents are not able to answer this or give us an estimate, and in that case, we will model or impute it largely off of the property value and some other variables of the owned housing unit. Most of our respondents are able to give us good information on what they think their property would sell for. So that sets up the calculus, and from there we can sort of look at a little bit more about the distribution of our samples. So I'm showing here on this slide the distribution of the Consumer Expenditure Survey from 2022 with respect to structure type. So you can see from this slide that owners primarily are occupying single-family housing units, with the majority of those being single-family detached units, or SFD. Only about 3% are in multifamily units. These are condominiums and high-rise and garden-style apartments and so forth. In contrast, renters have more of a 50-50 mix. Renters, 45 in CE, 45% were in single-family units and about 50% in those multifamily units. So how does this square with our housing survey, a completely different independent survey? So you can see from our housing survey, the rental units are almost 40% single family, with only about 25% single family detached and 60% in multifamily unit structures. Now, so the housing survey distribution is very close, very similar to the renters from the CE, but at issue is this. We have 25% of our housing survey sample that's single family detached. But because we're using it to approximate or impute owner's equivalent rent change, is this good representation? These 25% units need to represent 86% of the owner housing units for the OER index. Prior to January 2023, we had no weighting control to do this. And so the criticism was that the CPI OER index was upward biased. And so the structure change refinement that we implemented in January 2023 was myopically designed to solve this problem and mitigate the suspected upward bias. So now we'll go through each of these features that can cause the OER and rent index to diverge in a little bit more detail. And we'll start with the sample of housing units used in each area. So I just want to walk you through how we arrive at that sample and why they differ for OER and rent. So we'll start with a hypothetical city or CBSA. They're county-based. So here's an example one with 4 counties. You can see the urban area in the center with its suburbs shaded in a different color. It's sort of typical of what these metropolitan areas look like. The first thing we do is divide that entire geographic area into what we call segments. Loosely, you can call them neighborhoods. Technically, they're census block groups, which is the lowest geographic unit that the Census Bureau compiles and publishes socioeconomic and demographic data for. And we classify all of these neighborhoods into 3 basic types. The first type are segments or neighborhoods that are all owners. Every housing unit in the segment is owner occupied. There are no renters in the segment. This happens 5% of the time. And these segments, these neighborhoods, by definition, are ineligible for our survey because they're for the housing survey because there are no renters in them. Conversely, some segments have no owners. They're 100% renter occupied. This happens about 3% of the time. And these are eligible for our housing survey, and they are used for the rent index, but they're not used for OER because there are no owner occupied housing units in these neighborhoods. This sets up the first reason why the samples used are different. And then finally, the third class, and this is the vast majority, are segments that have both renter occupied units and owner occupied units. Okay, so once we've identified our eligible and ineligible segments, now we have to select a representative sample of segments to represent the city. So we do that scientifically and using a method that's systematic, using a probability proportional to size technique, PPS for short. And that size is the total rental value of the housing stock in the segment. and that is the rental value plus the owner equivalent value. And so how do we do that? We obtain the rental value expenditure or value from American Community Survey data, ACS. They provide the average rent for the census block and the number of rental units in that block. Multiply them together, you've got a rental value of the rented units in the neighborhood. For the owner value, a little bit more complicated. ACS does not provide a rental equivalent or market rent value for owned homes, so we have to estimate it at BLS. And we do that with DE data, some ACS data on property type, and some other data. But essentially, it's a model, and that gives us our average rental equivalent value. Multiply that by the number of owned units in a neighborhood, that gives us the owner value. So together, that's the segment's probability of selection. We select, once we select all the segments, it's about 120. For a city, we divide them into 6 panels. Now, why do we do this? So it would be extremely expensive to go to every housing unit and collect the price change for rent in our survey every single month, especially since rent change is sticky. Rent changes don't change monthly, typically. They change generally at the renewal of lease, which tends to be for most leases at every year, but they can be, some units can be on a month-to-month tenancy and change monthly. So for operational cost effectiveness, we go out and price each unit in our survey once every 6 months, so twice a year, and we do this in this panel structure. CBSA for this panel. 2 things to note here. When we say it's representative of the entire city, it's represented along a geographic dimension, but also a valuation dimension. So here are the 20 hypothetically selected samples for panel 1. You can see that they're dispersed throughout the CBSA geographically, but they're also represented by value. So we want to make sure that we have segments that are in low rent districts, low rent neighborhoods, median rent neighborhoods, and then high rent neighborhoods. So they're designed to be representative on both of those factors. So then panel 2 comes along, it's priced February and August, panel 3, and so on and so forth. So on average, 20 segments per panel. And then once we select our panels, we go and using quota sampling, we select 5 housing units per segment. One takeaway here, notice that there's no overlap in the segments by panel. They're mutually exclusive, not the exact same neighborhoods. And because our estimator uses a different panel each month, this does mean that month to month, the underlying sample in OER and rent are not from the exact same neighborhoods. And this might add some variability monthly to our estimators. But remember, these panels are designed to be representative of the entire CBSA and not statistically different. Okay, so here's a snapshot of what our underlying sample sizes end up after we do all of this sampling. Again, the number of census block groups or neighborhoods or segments in our selected cities are over 100,000. We sample 8,600, so that's a sampling rate of almost 8%. The number of rental housing units in these sampled cities are almost 25 million. This is from 2010 decennial census data. We target a sample size of 43,000 units, 0.2% sampling rate. The bottom of this slide shows you how that squares at different levels of geography. I would just highlight this one right here, the per CBSA panel. This effectively is our monthly sample size going into the published number each month. Roughly 96, almost 100 housing units we target in each of our cities each month for our estimator, with again 5 housing units per segment. Okay, one note about how does this sort of pan out, or what does it look like when we take structure type into account? So and what's the realized sample actually look like? So this is a demonstration of what our panel 1 sample for January 2024 looked like by segment and property type. 1% of the segments that were in the sample, this is nationwide, had only rental units. So these are included in the rent index, not included in OER. Almost 50% of the segments we selected were a mix of owned and rental units with at least one single family detached housing unit in the segment. And in fact, 60% of this middle category were segments with 100%, all of the units that we selected, all 5 single family detached units, and with 40% of this segment being less than 100% single family detached. Then this third type of segment is also a mix of owned and rental units with no single family detached units in it, and this occurred 50% of the time in our sampling. Also note that some of our segments have rent controlled units that end up being selected. This occurs in jurisdictions, cities that have rent control measures passed by local governments. Happens in New York, many of the California and West Coast cities have rent control. And this occurs 8% or occurred 8% of the time for our January 2024 sample. So remember, segments that are 100% rental are not used for OER. So these specific housing units on the left-hand side, not used for our OER estimator, and we do not use rent-controlled units in OER. They're used for rent, not used for OER. So you put all of that together, and the units used in January index calculation, a little over 6,000 for rent, a subset for OER. The OER sample is always a subset of the rent sample. So in this case, for January panel 1, the OER sample was 95% of our rent sample. All right, let's look at the unit level weight that's assigned to each unit. So here's a hypothetical example. A lot of information on this slide. I'm providing it for your reference. For those of you that have examined our handbook of methods and know our formulas back and forwards. So I promise no equations, but I do have a formula here showing you how you walk from row 1 down to row 17 to derive our unit level weights for each unit in the sample. It starts with ACS information. So in column A here, the renter units have a value of 150,000 expense. The owner units have a value of 1.5 million. That's because there are more owners, 500 versus 100. And the rental value that we estimate is of the owner units is 3,000 compared to 1,500. Where the total valuation for the entire city is 1.5 billion. We select 120 segments. We're selecting 5 housing units per segment. And so from here, you can sequence down with all of these factors. I'm not going to spend the time discussing what they mean during this webinar, but you end up with a final weight, and this is quantity. So for the rent index, each housing unit in this segment is representing 189 other rental units. But for OER, each housing unit selected represents a little over 2,000 housing units. So this sets up the scenario where the unit level weights can be different. And this is the way it was prior to January 2023. But effective for that month, we did introduce the structure type adjustment to better control for the single family detached proportion of the segment. So I show 2 hypothetical housing units here at the bottom. One is an apartment in a high rise, so it's non-single family detached. So for the structure type adjustment, we will reduce its weight by as much as a factor of 0.5, and in this example, I'm making it 0.5. So its weight goes from 2,000 down to about 1,000, while the other unit, which is a single family detached unit, can its weight can be doubled. No more than double, but it can be increased up to 2 times its previous weight. So in this example, the weight was 2,000. The structure type adjusted, increased it by 2, 4,000. So this structure type adjustment did add variability to the weights, unit level weights, but only for OER, not for rent. Okay. Prior to the adjustment, the unit level weights for each unit for OER were equal, different from rent, but equal with inside OER. So the structure type adjustment, while mitigating that suspected bias, did add a little variation, little month-to-month volatility in the weight scheme. Okay, let's move on to the rent value that's assigned to each unit and explain why that can be different. So here's a hypothetical example showing that we start at the top with the collected rent that we might collect out in the field. The previous month or 6 months ago for this panel, we collected a rent of 1,000. And then in the current month, our collected rent is 1,200. So the landlord increased the monthly rent by 20%, and this equates to 3.1% per month. We also found out at collection that previously the landlord was including electricity in the rent, but in the current month, it's no longer included. So we add that back in to the current month because we want to make sure that these two prices are comparable, of the same quality month to month, to measure pure price change. We also found out that the landlord added a garage parking space that was included in the rent, or included in the definition, the composition of the housing unit. Previously, it was not there, so we subtract that out to make the T-6 and T prices comparable. We also do there's a series of other adjustments that can be performed on structure type, and our analysts can make some adjustments. The other one I'm going to note here today and highlight is our age bias adjustment. Lots of literature on this. We have a scholarly article published on our website explaining how we derive this measure. But in a nutshell, houses depreciate over time as they age. And so if all else equal, the quality of the house in month T, it's older and not the same as it was in T-6. So what we do is adjust the previous month price to make it of the same vintage, the same age as the current structure, and that controls for this depreciation aspect. So when you do all of that, the contract rent, or what we would call economic rent, used for our rent index, it's different from the 20% as collected. It's smaller. It's 18.1%, which equates to 2.8 1-month change. Now let's look at that same information and how we adjust it for OER. Same collected rent, but here conceptually, we decided that for owner's equivalent rent, we want to remove utilities from the measure. Remember the question we asked in CE, what would your house rent for unfurnished and without utilities? So any contract rent that includes utility, electricity, natural gas, we have to estimate that component value and remove it from the contract price. So that $50 utility is removed for owner's equivalent rent. All the other adjustments are the same, and we arrive at different prices for OER. Here, 19% 6-month change, 2.91 month. Now, for January, the distribution of this economic versus pure, or the rent versus OER price change, was as follows. 45% of the time, the prices that we use to calculate for the exact same mix of housing units, the OER price change was higher than the rent price change because of this utility adjustment and other adjustments. 30% of the time they were equal, and 25% of the time the OER measure was slightly lower than the rent. Okay, finally, I'm running close on time, so I'll talk about the area weights. This is the second level spending data, the aggregation weights that we use across area to publish our US city average indexes. What I'm showing here at the top is the underlying source data from CE monthly since 2014, used to compute the owner's equivalent rent index weights. And at the bottom is the relative importance or budget share of rent. And you can see from this slide that pre-pandemic, the average weight or budget share or relative importance of owner's equivalent rent in the entire CPI market basket was roughly 22%, but increasing. And post-pandemic, there was a sharp jump in April of 2022 before coming back down, but still increasing. So the average post-pandemic relative importance of OER, 24% increasing. In contrast, the weight of rent has been relatively stable. It's sort of hovering around 7.5% relative importance. But it's not necessarily these national averages that matter. It's the relative weight of OER versus rent in each of our component cities that can contribute to OER minus rent US city average divergence. So let's take a look at that. So what I'm showing here is a heat map of the 75 cities in our sample. And it's the difference. It's the weight that each of these areas has in OER minus the weight that each of these areas carry for rent. So areas shown in red and darker shades of red carry much more weight in the owner's equivalent rent index than they do in the rent index. In contrast, areas shown in blue and darker blue carry much more weight for the rent index than they do for the OER index. So for example, we can take New York. New York, high value area with respect to rent and property value, so that it contributes a lot to both. However, the New York metropolitan area is largely, the majority, it's rental units, not owned units. 53% of the New York housing units are rented. And so therefore, New York carries a much larger weight for rent than it does for owner's equivalent rent, 6.2 versus 9.1. That's in contrast to the South Atlantic areas and the East North Central areas that are predominantly more owner occupied, and so they contribute more to the owner's equivalent rent index compared to the rent. So this matters because even if the owner's equivalent rent component index and the rent index were identical in each city, you could still get a divergence between OER and rent because the relative contribution of each city to the national average is different. So that's an interesting story here. So finally, almost out of time, I just want to conclude with a little bit more information about the single family detached housing unit adjustment and sort of some of the underlying data going on there. So this chart shows for the past 2 years, the dark line at the bottom, the average proportion or the percentage of our housing unit sample that is single family detached units, relatively consistent around 25%. Prior to January 2023, when we made the structure type adjustment, these units represented 35% of the OER index. And you might be asking, well, why 35%? Why? There's no adjustment, no control for it, the levels. Why shouldn't it be 25%? The reason is that where these single family detached units end up in our segment sample can vary. They can be in high segment valued versus low segment value. And so it's the difference in where the single family detached units are that reflects the weighting being slightly higher in OER than in rent. So on average, prior to the adjustment, single family detached units were carrying roughly 35% of the OER index. But look, it does vary. It's not flat. There is a little bit of variation going on. And this variance is caused by the panel structure. You know, this high point in February is the same high point in August. This is panel 2. So there's a little bit of variance in this number by the nature of the panel structure. Once we implemented the improvement, which was to ratio calibrate our single-family detached units to these ACS controls, it did end up boosting the weight of single-family detached units on average by almost 10%. So in 2023, the average weight of single-family detached units in our sample was 44%. Now you might be asking, isn't that a little bit low? The ACS data suggests it should be 75 or 80%. Even the CE data shows over 80% of owners are in single-family detached units. I showed that previously. The reason why it's not up at that target is because of that cap. Remember, we put a cap on the adjustment. We do not want to increase the unit level weight of any housing unit more than double. And the reason we put the cap is because we don't want the weight of any one unit to carry such an enormous proportion of the index, because that could introduce severe monthly price volatility when you couple or dovetail the weight with the price. So it's capped, and so we would expect, due to this refinement or this adjustment, the intent was to raise the weight of the single family detached proportion. That's what it's doing. It's working, and it should hover around 50%. And you can see that this method, we do rebenchmark as new ACS data become available. And we do that in January of every year. So in January 2024, you do see a tick up here at the very end of the series where it was 50%, roughly 50%, and that was caused by primarily the ACS benchmarking. But remember, the sampling units, I may not have mentioned this, but every unit selected for our sample, housing survey sample, is in the survey for 6 years, and then we rotate it out and replace it with new housing units, new segments. We do this to be representative of current population shifts and so forth. So every month, there's a little bit of rotation going on. So the mix of segments is happening, and that also can contribute to this variance. Okay, so I think so that's the weight side. Let's take a quick moment to look at the price side. What I'm showing here is the unweighted average price change for 1 month over the last 2 years. All units, the blue line with the squares, and single family detached units, the dotted line. And you can see, by and large, the average price change for single family detached units is lower than the average price change for all units. This is consistent with the prior research, but there are some anomalies. You can see that in January, at the unweighted level, single family detached units actually had the average price change was slightly higher than all units. And that same result occurred in the same panel for 2020-22. It did not occur in January of 2023. But this also explains why the weight of single family detached units went up slightly in January. The prices did as well. And so the two together contributed to the OER and rent divergence. I think I am out of time, so I'm going to stop there and turn it back to our host, Jeff Hill, for questions and answers. Thank you.
Okay, Rob, that was just incredible. That is a ton of information, quite amazing. Why don't you take a breath for a minute, leave your slides up, please. We have a lot of questions. We've answered some. We'll just run a little bit over here with trying to answer a few more questions. One really interesting one that just came up on our new, and I wish I knew the answer to this. On our new tenant rent index, our research index, does that include the structure type adjustment? Do you know? Or maybe Bill or Paul are on, and they can answer that. Because I don't know the answer to that one.
I do not know the answer to that either. So, well, we can get that answered.
Yeah, Bill's here. Maybe he knows.
Yeah.
Right, and so it's my understanding, because that is a subset of the CPI sample, it does reflect the structure adjustment where it would apply to those units.
All right. Well, that's a very interesting question. We will try to get that answer and make sure that we are updating that on our web page. Rob, probably the biggest set of answers that we have, of questions, sorry, that we have in here is around this divergence. Will it continue moving forward? Will this gap normalize now that we have updated these weights until perhaps we update the weights next year? Obviously, at BLS, we do not forecast.
Yep.
And we are not going to try to forecast what's going to happen with the decomposition effects here. But
that's
did you have
correct.
anything that you wanted to add to that?
No, you're absolutely right. We cannot forecast, we cannot predict what will happen with these decompositions. I will say that, this is January is just one panel. There's still 5 more panels to come. And so the effect of the new benchmarking will be reflected in these panels, but it's not clear that it will be higher or lower than the 2023 numbers. It all is a function of the actual segments in the sample and the single family detached proportions from ACS in those segments. And most importantly, we've got to have single family detached units in our sample in those segments. If we don't have any, we can't make the adjustment. So the adjustment fails. And, that fails. It looks like I think I showed a slide on that it fails 50% of the time because we simply, it's very, very,
slide, you can.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult to find renters in high income segments, neighborhoods that are predominantly single family detached areas. They're mostly owner occupied. So that is sort of the problem. And why we have to do the adjustment in the first instance, because we just do not have a representative sample of single family detached units in the survey for OER. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Thanks, Rob, there. Another question that I thought was really interesting. Okay, so we did this update in January 24 of updating the structure type weights, right? But it seems like this change was maybe smaller than the initial introduction of the structure type weights in January of 23. Could you talk about that a little bit and maybe mention why the effects may have been different? You may not have looked into this and tried to do the detailed decomposition that you provided today, but if you did have any thoughts on that, that would be great.
Well, I think just initially the answer to that question is based on the underlying prices associated with the weights. So you can see in January 2023, that's this point right here, right? When we first introduced the structure type adjustment, which would have raised the weight of single family detached units in OER, it was coupled with price changes for single family detaches that were lower than other units. So the two measures perhaps offset one another. It's really this, it's the prices being a little bit higher as well as the proportion as the weights that's contributing to OER being the 0.2 sort of anomaly in January of 2024. So I think that's the answer to your question, Jeff.
Okay, that's great. Just trying to see, there are a lot of similar questions to that. Here's one about, and maybe the person is not quite asking this correctly, but we'll see. Can you explain why 60% of the survey for OER is multifamily units and the single family rental percentage is 25%? I think you had that on one of your slides.
Oh, here we go. So the data on the left of this table come from the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which is a sample of owners and a representative sample of owners and renters. Roughly 60, I have down in the note, I think I need to update this information, but owners are roughly 65% of the CE sample interview survey, while renters are about 35%. It just turns out that representative sample, we are getting owners in their unit is single family detached 86% of the time. This is consistent and similar to the ACS numbers, by the way. So and again, the renter mix is also consistent with ACS and consistent with our rental unit distribution.
Rob, if you could go back to slide 11, you were showing about the contribution of the structure type adjustment is about 5%, I believe.
Yes.
0.009, is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
So is that equivalent to saying that the additional 5 percentage point reweight on single family was behind that 0.009?
Say that one more time, please.
Is what you're showing here equivalent to saying that the additional 5 percentage point reweight on the single family was behind that increase of 0.009?
Yes. So to do this counterfactual exercise, we simply removed, well, maybe it's more than that. We removed the structure type adjustment altogether. Before the adjustment, remember the unit level weights. This is technically how the analysis was done. The unit level weights, housing unit level weights for OER within a segment were equal. After the adjustment, they became unequal with more weight. So single family detached units higher than non-single family detached units. To take that adjustment out, you simply set the weights equal by removing the adjustment. So this 5% sort of reflects in January the totality of the adjustment in the first instance, not necessarily myopically, just the fact that the adjustment, the weights were around 45% in December and 50% in January. It's removing the adjustment altogether, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Here's a question about why do you adjust OER for utilities?
This is a fantastic question. Conceptually, we've always done that. It's something that we could look into, that maybe we don't have to do that. I think it could be just for burden and ease of collecting the information. On the rent side, it's easier to collect contract rent, what the actual rental charge is to the tenant, and we don't have to worry about asking, well, how much of that do you think was for your utility? How much of that do you think was for X, Y, and Z? On the owner side, I think this is perhaps the reason. It's just difficult to get owners on the spending side from the CE survey to estimate what their rental equivalence value is. So, we would have to ask some owners, what do you think your unit would rent for without utilities? Because some of the contracts, rental contracts from are without utilities. Oh, by the way, what do you think your house would rent for if you included utilities? So it's extra burden, I suppose, that we'd be putting on the CE respondents. And so to avoid that sort of trickiness, conceptually, we just decided to pull utilities out of the pure rent measure. But we don't necessarily have to do it that way, and that's something that we could take a look at. And if it could remove some of this variation, we could possibly change.
All right,
I don't know. I invite some of my colleagues, maybe Bill or some of the housing experts on my team, to speak up if you think you have a different answer than I just gave.
Well, Rob, we have another question. I think we should go to. This is going to be a tougher question. This is going to be a tougher question, I think. All right. So you had 2 slides decomposing OER and the rent changes in January 24. And I think one of those showed about 50% of the difference attributed to the unit level weight assigned to each unit. I believe that's there. But then the next slide seems to imply a smaller amount would be attributed to the change. Could you explain that?
Okay, yeah, this is a fantastic question, and this gets really into the technical, statistical aspects of these decompositions. So remember, the order that one does this exercise matters. If I started with owner's equivalent, so let me put up these percentages. So I started with rent here, and I worked my way up to owner's equivalent rent. And doing it this way suggests that the unit level weights explain half the gap, half the difference. if I went in the, and also I did it additively. You do not necessarily have to do each of these counterfactuals additively. You could do them in isolation. I just think the story is easier to tell if you do it additively. If I flipped it and I did owner's equivalent rent, started with that and worked backwards, I would get a different story that would suggest the unit level weights has much less contribution to the gap. In fact, around 20%. So that's A. And none of this analysis here removes single family detached units, right? Because remember, there are two reasons why the unit level weights can differ. It's because of this single family detached for OER, the single family detached adjustment that we started making, but also because the valuation of segments for the owned housing stock is different than the valuation of segments for the renter housing stock. And I believe it's that latter difference or reason that the unit level weights can differ is really the bigger factor here, right? And that shows up in this second slide here. Like when you just remove the structure type adjustment, you get a small difference, right? But if you remove single family detached units altogether, under this scenario, the weights are back to equal, and now the only difference within a segment, and the only difference in the unit level weights is now the segment valuation, and you can see that there's a bigger gap here when you remove the single family detached unit. So I think that answers, or I'm hoping that answers the question.
Okay, great. Just again, speaking about the proportion of the single family detached, we saw this spike in January, right, of 50%. Does it mean this will happen again in July due to the sampling rotation?
Well, you can't predict, because remember, a little bit of the, every month we are rotating in every panel a proportion, 1/72 of the segments. So there's going to be a mix of segments coming in and out. So it's you just can't predict what will happen in the future. We can expect some volatility based on our methods, but we can't conclusively say, oh, it's going to be higher or lower one way or the other.
Okay, let's see here. So many really good questions, although a lot are about things relating to predictions. How much could utility price fluctuations impact OER? Have there been meaningful changes to that adjustment or adjustment methodology?
Also a great question. I don't know the nuances of that. I'm going to call on Bill Thompson or Paul Leegee or Jeff Medlar staff that work with the data more closely to answer that question.
Hi, yeah, I'm Bill Thompson here. So the exact impact per unit is not all that great, but it's applied to every OER unit that we do have. So cumulatively, it can be kind of significant. I'm not quite sure. I think we probably have done some evaluation of that, but I just don't have the information in front of me to give you like a more precise response than that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
I will say, I will
Bill.
add this. Thank you very much, Bill. I'll add this. When I was preparing this presentation, I did have one slide. I decided to remove it because it looks very complicated. But it was essentially a scatter plot of all 6,000 units used in the January estimator that showed how the rent and OER price changes diverged, and that's caused by this utility adjustment, and how the weights diverged in a Cartesian plane. And if all those dots were very closely compacted around the 0, 0 mark, not much variation. But when you look at it, there's a lot, there's variation, both on the price side and the weight side. So the story is both. The reason the OER and the rent indexes diverge is because we have these variability in the prices, but also the weights. So we do say, generally, owner's equivalent rent is imputed by our the rent sample in OER, but they're really different. It's because of all of the features that I walked through can set up this scenario where they can be different.
I'm seeing from one of our statisticians that research in the past has suggested utility costs yield no significant price relative changes.
Yeah,
that's interesting. Okay, I think we're going to just do one more question and then we will stop because we are over time. When making these changes in methodology, do you backdate the changes, or are the period over period changes left unadjusted, and thus are they left unadjusted?
By and large, we do not backdate. I don't think any methodological change to our calculus that we've made over the years do we apply retroactively. Someone can correct me if I'm missing something, but yeah, we don't backdate.
I believe that is right. Okay. I think with that, we will stop. We really appreciate all the questions. We appreciate the interest in the Consumer Price Index and all of BLS's price, employment, compensation, and productivity statistics. As I had said at the beginning, we will be posting this webinar on the BLS website, on the BLS YouTube channel. We will be continuing to update our methodological information, and we will try to post more questions and answers, more FAQ type information based on the questions we've received here and the many, many other questions we've received over the past week or so. So thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate it. And we look forward to talking with folks more. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.